Hey friends, thanks for joining me, Jim Baroud, to hear a few insights from leaders who represent our innovation ecosystem. Today's chat is with Yat Su, the co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands Limited.
My name is Yat. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. We're a global company, really, although headquartered in Hong Kong, that's been focused really on delivering true digital property rights. And, we're typically known to have done this in the gaming space, but, we have over 450 investments. We have, over a dozen subsidiaries in the space, including companies like The Sandbox, for instance, or companies like Anyway that are making games for, basically the Bored Apes ecosystem, Rev Racing, and Tiny Tap, the education side. So a whole range of companies that are also building out and delivering essentially the Web3 vision through their various products and services. We're about 1,000 people around the world right now. And again, I would say that although we're known for gaming and investments, we're really about delivering basically the vision of Web3, which is the web of ownership.
Wonderful. Okay, so tell us about your entrepreneurial journey. You seem to have done so much in a short amount of time. So why don't you start with high school?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it somewhat short. It's because I'm dating myself now when I say that my entrepreneurial journey sort of started in the 80s. So definitely now you kind of know roughly what my age is. I started sort of writing software. So I studied music at in Vienna, and what happened really was that because my parents, particularly my mother, was a talented musician, so she thought I should be learning music as well, which is what I did. And since we grew up in Austria, in Vienna as well, it was sort of I was a bit of an anomaly, right? I mean, there's not that many Asian people living in Austria today, but there were far, far fewer, back in the 80s. And back then, of course, it was a little bit difficult in certain ways. And being a sort of, I guess you could call it somewhat foreign child, even though I spoke the language fluently, in the field of music, in Vienna, it was, I guess you could say, a little difficult to find the community that sort of spoke to you. And I ended up writing software that helped me sort of interact with, it helped me basically sort of make my music life easier because I wrote composition software. And this composition software basically enabled me to write music faster than my peers, which did not impress my teachers because, you have to remember back in the 80s, even using a calculator in class was considered somewhat sort of inappropriate. So let alone, a computer that will help you compose. But I uploaded the software on the pre-internet service called CompuServe. And what then happened is that the community inside CompuServe appreciated it, and they started sending me sort of money. And there was no PayPal, so it was literally checks, and I didn't have a bank account at that point because I was like 13 or so. And so that was sort of my first foray into the quasi-entrepreneurial experience, which eventually led to a job at Atari, who reached out and said, "We like the software. Why don't you come work for us?" And I waltzed into the one-man office in Vienna, and they're like, "Who are you?" And you called me over, and they're like, "Oh." And it didn't matter that I was 13. It didn't matter that I was an Asian kid. It didn't matter, anything really, because I knew how to do something. And that really was sort of, if you think about it, sort of what fascinated me about sort of, I guess, the internet or what was to become the internet. And sort of, I guess, my first metaversal experience, shall we say, even though it isn't what it is today, of course, in terms of what the virtual plane can give us. And with that, I went to the US because Atari eventually sort of sponsored my education. And when I was there, I started getting engaged in different areas of work because Atari went under. I started writing basically VRML software, which stands for Virtual Reality Markup Language, which is markup language. It was basically HTML, but for VR. Right? But we're talking early 90s here, so definitely very early days. And the graphics were terrible, but everyone had this vision that we're going to be shopping and experiencing life in VR. So I think to some ways that sort of vision has come to pass, but it took like, a whole 20 plus years for that actually to even be remotely possible. And that journey, because SGI acquired that business, basically sent me out to Asia because, business planning early 90s was, you look Asian, you should go work in Asia. We're like, sure, right? Having never worked there, having never lived there before properly. So I went to Japan, I went to Taiwan, and then I came to Hong Kong. And because my father is originally from Hong Kong, I was able to get permanent residency. So I didn't need a visa to live and work there. More importantly, I couldn't get my email because they didn't have internet. And so this was now, again, maybe 93 or something like that, 94, like the rough time. I was like, well, maybe I should set up an ISP. And I set up, one of Hong Kong's very first internet service providers called Hong Kong Online, which was a really tough journey because nobody in Hong Kong needed the internet. They were like, why would you want that? But it sort of speaks a little bit to my historical journey because I would normally set up sort of businesses or services or things that I thought were useful to people because they were useful to me, right? Like the internet helped me. I got to meet many friends this way. I got my career that way. So why wouldn't others want that? I thought, right? But most people in Hong Kong were like, I don't need this. But then the people who flocked to this service were actually young people, people who were still in school or in college who really saw the benefit of this. But they didn't have any money, so they couldn't pay me for anything. So I ended up taking a job at AT&T where I was able to sort of support the operations of this because at that point I had hundreds of thousands of people relying on the service that couldn't pay me any money. So I had to sort of make a choice here. And how do I keep this going? There was no investors to be had, right? There was no revenue model because advertising didn't work. I tried that. So I kind of felt a sense of duty to like maintain the service. And it was pretty terrible because people had to wait hours to upload their content and they would still wait, right? So it was that important for them. So, I couldn't just drop it. So I worked at AT&T by day and I maintained essentially our sort of what became a free email and a hosting service provider by night, effectively, running sort of the community, which eventually then was acquired many years after with, when the dot-com boom happened in the US and companies were trying to sort of, consolidate various internet businesses and they were looking to acquire eyeballs. And so we had a lot of eyeballs in the relative sense. And fortunately got acquired. And with that money, I started one of Asia's very first, maybe the first cloud computing business called Outblaze. Fast forward a little bit because, there's been, that's like, we're talking about a decade fast forward, but effectively, we sold that business to IBM. It became basically IBM's cloud computing center in the Asia Pacific region. And with that, basically, because we had a non-compete, I started basically a gaming business called Animoca, which is before Animoca Brands, and had sort of, some early successes in terms of some mobile gaming hits, of which we got deplatformed by Apple because we had too much dominance in the App Store. And they apparently, we will never truly know because they just removed the apps, abused the App Store rules. But honestly, we don't know what that means, right? Because nobody actually sent us a real letter. And all of our apps got deleted. It took us over a year to get back onto the App Store. And that sort of was this rude awakening for us from, why we became such big believers in sort of the vision of Web3, because in Web1, which was the early days of the internet, it was all about open source and decentralization of information and freedom of information. And then in Web2, it suddenly became these walled gardens that controlled your existence, whether this was Facebook or Apple or sort of the platforms out there. And you suddenly existed on their rules without any due process. And so we directly experienced this. And so just to fast forward a little bit more, that gaming business, which was one of the top mobile gaming companies in the early 2011, 2012, obviously lost its pole position because of what happened with Apple, and found essentially with NFTs, with CryptoKitties back in 2017, sort of a way in which you could actually own our digital assets and free yourselves from sort of, I guess, the control of these platforms. And that really excited us. And so we decided to go all in on this space, which was eventually known as Web3 today. But back then, it was really sort of NFTs and blockchain. And we today have over 450 investments in the space. We're probably most known for having sort of built and operated things like Sandbox, but also for having invested in Axie Infinity and OpenSea, in Dapper Labs, and Wax, Decentraland, all these companies in the early days, to where we are now today. One of the sort of, I guess, bigger companies in the Web3 trying to sort of push forward the vision of true digital property rights, which is really the mission of Animoca Brands.
That's amazing. So I didn't realize all the investments you've made. So do you consider yourself also an investor / accelerator of?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I think the thing for us is that we invested the majority of our investments through our balance sheet. So we don't have a fund. So in that sense, it's, we are a VC, but not your typical VC. We can take very long positions because we don't require essentially a return cycle in the classic sense, because we don't have to liquidate our funds to give back to investors in the same way, because it's not a fund. We use it for operating capital. We expand the business. We grow it. We also have this view that Web3 is going to be the future of the internet 10, 20 years down the road. So, if we're selling off our positions now, it's a little bit like sort of, selling off your, profitable positions in 2001, 2002, from the Amazons and, Apples and Googles of the world. So I would say that's kind of our lens at this moment in time. But we're primarily an operating business, right? We have 1,000 people working, and they're not basically all working on investments. And in fact, the vast majority are making products, making games, all that type of stuff.
So a company that gets bought or invested from you is actually, you're a friendly strategic accelerator or investor. Is that how they should?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, some people say, is it like a venture builder? Maybe. I mean, really what we do often is we acquire Web2 companies, and then we try to onboard the Web2 audiences into Web3. And by giving them digital property rights, by giving them a way in which you can have capital formation and assets, and also helping tokenize the infrastructure of the business as well. So that's what we've done with Sandbox. That's what we are currently doing with TinyTap. And we also launched the educational sort of infrastructure around the EDU token. So there's a bunch of things that we do along the lines that help us sort of build that out with various sort of products and services that we do as an organization.
And so the company's private now. Is there a vision to take it public at some point?
So we are an interesting beast in the sense that we are actually a public company, but unlisted. So we have something like close to 2,800 or more shareholders. So we are a public company. We do have to report our finances. You can see our financial reports online, but we are not trading on a stock exchange, which we eventually believe we should, in the future, maybe in a few years down the road.
That's so interesting. And what was the reason for that?
Well, we were a publicly listed company in Australia as a gaming company. And what happened was that we delisted because, in large part because, crypto was very controversial. And it was very difficult for the stock exchange to, accept basically crypto native companies on the stock exchange, because we weren't a crypto company when we listed. We became one after. And there's some interesting rules that you can see in Australia around companies such as ours that sort of made it hard. So anyway, we got delisted and operated essentially as a semi-private, sort of private public company, which is also interesting because from a governance standpoint, we only have one class of shares, and there's no single shareholder that has a golden share or majority vote. So we are effectively operating in a more limited sense, almost like a DAO, meaning that everything is governance driven. We need to have shareholder votes. We need to have shareholder meetings and to basically pass consensus decisions on major items.
That is fascinating. And so, we've seen a lot of changes in this space, right? From, crypto going down, NFTs losing some of their luster. And so how do you view sort of that? You've seen a lot, right? So how do you view those changes in the marketplace, or how, as an opportunity or sort of a short-term thing, or what's your take on all the changes?
Well, so first of all, if you take a look at the lens of generally the space, be it NFTs or be it crypto, over a longer period of time, it's generally up, right? I mean, people have to understand that if they don't appreciate already that, what happened in 21 and early 22 was a cycle, right? As we see many market cycles. And so while there was probably a little bit of sort of over exuberance that's come down, you basically get a new cycle that's coming back up again. And long term, basically, the trend increases because there's more adoption, there's more users using it. For people who don't remember, in 2018, for instance, Bitcoin hovered around $3,000, right? And that wasn't that long ago, right? If you think about it, right? And 2019 wasn't much better. So really, when people talk about this being a crypto winter with Bitcoin at almost $30,000, it's 10 times better than it was 4 years ago, right? So yeah, if you take the peak and you say, okay, well, what was the price like at the end of 2021? Yes, you would say it's down, something like, 30, 40%. But if you take a look at the longer perspective, it's broadly doing okay. And that's because of the fact that you have to take these longer lenses. It's like looking at economies of nations. You can't just look at a specific sort of, subset and measure between 6 to 12 months. You have to look at the longer period of its evolution. When you think of the number of smart contracts that are being deployed, you think of the number of the wallets that are coming on board, you think of the number of the adoption and usage that's being used, particularly in places like Asia, the whole Web3 space and also NFTs in particular continuing to grow and accelerate in its usage. Last year, in what's supposed to be the height of a bear market with all the sort of catastrophes that happened in crypto, NFTs still sold over $24 billion worth of NFTs. And in comparison, creator platforms like Spotify only did about $7 to $8 billion, right? So in terms of what they shared to creators, because this is the thing, of the $24 billion, 90% of its value went to creators and owners of these NFTs, which is so different from the Web2 creator platforms. So in that sense, the equation for creators in Web3 is already so much better economically. Why would you ever want to go back to Web2, for instance? Right? But of course, a lot of people don't know that yet, or they don't understand that because it's still an alien concept. So we have to continue to explain that. But that's basically, really what's happening.
Wow. And what about, the regulations in the States? I mean, we had the recent one with Ripple. On the other hand, Coinbase seems to be under attack. How do you view, what's happening now in a larger global context?
So first of all, I think definitely when it comes to Web3 and generally the crypto narrative, it's definitely a bifurcation in terms of views. The US has, but I would say particularly one section of the US, because it's not fair to say all of the US, right? But one section of the US has taken a negative view towards it, even though the Ripple case, which we'll talk about later perhaps, is very interesting because it now gives a nuanced view as to what a token is, that you can't basically do a one size fits all, that a token actually has different perspectives and different narratives based on its context, which I think is appropriate. Now, when you take a look at Asia, though, for instance, when you look at Hong Kong, for instance, or even China's narrative, or Japan, they've taken a very positive view on Web3. They've become crypto forward. When you look at, for instance, Hong Kong allowing retail trading crypto, giving licenses to various exchanges, allowing crypto ETFs, having the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is basically the monetary authority, essentially provide guidance to banks saying, do business with crypto companies, right? Or the Japanese Prime Minister saying that Web3 and the metaverse is the future of Japan, for instance, or it's part of his national agenda, in stark contrast to what we're seeing in the US. It just shows that not the world isn't agreeing with the US perspective. It's also showing that, for the first time, perhaps, the US is maybe not leading in a technology segment, which it typically always has. And again, I think this choice was a political choice. I don't think it was a sort of, let's call it, sort of a fundamental choice. It was really something that I think is politically motivated. China, for instance, launched a Web3 white paper talking about how important basically Web3 is for the future of the internet. And while they don't make much mention of crypto, obviously, they do mention on national television and CCTV that you can now buy Bitcoin in Hong Kong in a legal and regulated manner. So you're basically telling the whole Chinese audience that if you want to get crypto, you can probably do it in Hong Kong, which is part of Chinese territory. So again, what should we read into that? I mean, I'll let everyone else figure that out, but it does seem more than just a happy coincidence.
So interesting, so interesting. And what about, we learned about the, getting kicked off Apple. You learned before that about building something amazing in Hong Kong, at such a young age. I mean, what some of the lessons learned through those ups and downs?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest lesson I would say for that I've learned or I've generally been following on is sort of building essentially for a purpose that's greater than your own, I think is very important. Because if you are building for something like that, then you can take these punches. Right? You can sacrifice things because you're building for something that's really critically important for the future. Whereas if you're doing it, for instance, what a lot of people sometimes do just for money, which is understandable because money is sort of a means to another end, perhaps because you want to buy a house or because you want to have financial freedom, all these things, which is totally understandable. But the problem is that there's many other ways to make money, right? And if this path becomes difficult and your purpose is to make money, then you will switch as you should, because it's maybe there's a better way to do it. Whereas if you're actually believing, in our case, in digital property rights, in a better internet, in one that's fairer, for instance, in which we can, like one of our big visions around why Web3 is so important is that we believe that we can have everyone have a form of ownership in this next internet, because we can all be stakeholders. If you own an NFT or if you own tokens in Ethereum or something, you become a stakeholder in the ecosystem. You share in its success. It's a way in which you can all have equity, which has eluded most of the world, which is why we have wealth inequality. Right? We think shareholder capitalism has caused this inequality and antitrust rules don't work anymore. So Web3 solves that because it's inherently anti-monopolistic because we all share in the network. And therefore, we can partake in that success. When we use Instagram, why are we giving our content for free? We should be owning a stake in it every time we share photos, for instance. Like that's actually what Web3 really means, except of course, in the Web2 narrative, we don't have any of that. We're digitally colonized. That's a really important future we think needs to be built. And we think it's one that creates a better world for everyone. And so if you believe in this vision, as we do, then we can take these punches. We can keep fighting on. And it doesn't matter when there's a couple of winters coming our way, or a couple of thunderstorms, or volcanoes, as we've seen last year. We'll still hang around and keep building because it's so important.
And so you mentioned digital ownership, and obviously NFTs are a vehicle, gaming and educational, which I had not known until recently how big a space that is for you folks. So talk about how that relates, the gaming part and educational NFTs.
Yeah, so why do we focus on gaming initially with digital ownership? Is because we think most gamers, of which there's 3.4 billion out there, which is almost 2/3 of the world's internet, they already believe they should be owning the items, right? In fact, they don't think they're renting them. So if a player buys a skin on Fortnite, he doesn't think he's renting it like someone rents a tux for prom night. He thinks that it is his property, for instance, and that he has entitlements to them, except he doesn't. And so the thing about owning something, regardless of whether it's physical or digital, means that you have the freedom to transact, the freedom to do whatever you want with it, and the freedom to basically let people compose experiences and share in those network effects, right? So we do this in the physical world, for instance. The fact that I own a car means that I can paint the car red or blue. I can sell it. I can have a baby seat. I can install a new radio system. And the businesses that do that can come to me and say, hey, I've got a new baby seat for you. Or, hey, I can make your seats into leather, or I can make it into something that's made out of nice wool or something. I can customize services for you that give you value for your experience in your car because I own the car and I don't need to seek permission from the third parties. And as a result of that, the ecosystem around the ownership of cars is far, far greater and richer than the actual sale of the car itself. And it also makes the car more valuable in return because I can do so many more things with the car and have so many more experiences with the car than just taking it from point A to point B, which was its originally intended utility. So the same would be said for gaming items. If, for instance, my skins in Fortnite were actually on blockchain and I could actually use them as NFTs, then thousands of other game companies would utilize these skins inside their games. And not just because it's a way of customer acquisition, but because it's a way in which they can sort of use that content inside their games because I no longer have to seek permission from Epic to say, am I allowed to use these skins? I just have to go to the end user and say, would you like to experience the skins in my game, for instance? And you could have things like Fortnite Fashion Week emerge or other things that are made by third parties. What that means is that the end user who owns these skins gets rich experiences because he owns these assets, which in turn will make the assets more desirable and more valuable and therefore create better network effects around them. And so theoretically, everyone benefits. But of course, in the walled garden, people don't like that because, of course, while people benefit, you also decentralizing power, decentralizing influence. Because when the skins start spreading to usages outside of their own ecosystem, they have to start taking into account what happens when they make changes in their own game to ecosystems around the world, which is, by the way, how the world works, right? I mean, that's how free trade works, right? I can't just make a change of my sort of supply dynamics in my country without having an impact on what I think it changes in another country. I can't just change inflation or deflation without taking into account what impact it has for global trade, for instance. Right? To us, that's a positive because it requires us to start thinking empathetically about the rest of the ecosystem and not actually just thinking about selfishly about just what we care about and how it just functions for us. Obviously there's a self-interested part, but we have to balance it against an ecosystem, which is what we like so much about the ethos of Web3. And so with education, it's kind of the same thing, because what happens in education through these NFTs, teachers who can make content with NFTs and then sell them on platforms that would make maybe $10 or $20 or maybe $100 a year, now have the benefit of capital formation, because now I can basically buy this educational content that might make $100 a year, and someone's willing to pay $500 or $1,000 for it because I get 10 to 20% yield, right? This is not possible before on low value items because yield generating assets needed to be larger in size to make it worthwhile for a lawyer or for a contract to be involved, right? Which means I could only really sell this type of stuff in physical property rights for something that makes maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars because, and the legal cost to do the transaction is just too expensive. But with an NFT, you can transfer all the legal and royalty and transfer of monies within a single transaction, which basically means that, for effectively less than $1, you can basically take care of all of the legalities, shall we say, that you traditionally would be doing through a lawyer and transfer ownership. That means that in places like Venezuela, for instance, or in the Philippines, where teachers make only tens of dollars a month, can now actually make life-changing money creating content through NFTs. We've seen this effect with artists as well. So what it really means is that when you have property rights in anything, regardless of whether it's physical or digital, you can have capital formation and you can invest in the long term. Imagine if you could never own your house. Well, then you could never get a mortgage. You could never get money for that. You couldn't reinvest it, right? These sort of things you can't have when you don't have property rights. It's also the reason why countries that have property rights, like the US, for instance, or Canada or Europe, have very strong GDPs and are amongst the wealthiest nations in the world. In comparison to countries that have no property rights, like North Korea, they might have a lot more people, but they actually have, no economies to speak of, and they have generally are in a state of poverty because they have no ability to have all the benefits of capitalism that's only possible with property rights. So that relationship essentially now extends. That property rights capitalist narrative is now able to extend into the digital world because of NFTs, because of Web3, because of blockchain.
Got it. And so the trends you see in that space now, obviously we've just talked about the ups and downs. Is the future, obviously, I think, bright? And where is the growth going to come from?
Well, right now, the growth is definitely coming from Asia because the regulatory framework is very friendly and people are sort of really trying to push it. And you have to understand also there's a couple of reasons why. One of them, it's engaging in youth narrative. It's also how sort of nations are seeing themselves as building a role in technology that they've basically lost out to Western or specifically US technologies. I mean, think about, for instance, in places like Asia, what products and services are their users, is the population using? Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, Amazon, right? These are all US-based technologies. And in the Web2 narrative means that the data is owned and captured by these companies and controlled by them. So that's not great for sovereign nation states to have that situation. So that's one big reason why they're pushing Web3. But the other one is also that it's around sort of making sure that end users have more freedoms themselves and basically have the ability to have more prosperity, right? I mean, that's one of the big problems you have today where there's such wealth inequality. How are you able to sort of provide a framework for younger generations of people to actually provide, a way to make a fair income? And so Web3 provides that infrastructure potential as well. So that's one of the reasons why Asia is pushing this agenda so hard. And that's why we also think that growth will come from this from the Asia region. Now, that said, you can't count out the US. There's a lot of people who are building in the US. They've been a little spooked by some of the actions, but the Ripple case definitely has sort of put a little bit more energy into it because now people understand the nuance around it, and so are willing to perhaps sort of re-explore what they were not willing to explore before. And again, because we think that the anti-crypto narrative in the US has been largely political, we think of it as a cycle as opposed to something that's more sort of permanent. And it's also only between a certain subset of people. So we think, again, that that's something that, will self-correct itself over time, and the US will become, again, a pretty dominant player in the whole Web3 space.
Got it. But speaking geopolitically, when we talk about China, obviously you've said they've sort of open in some ways, but the recent issues with Alibaba and the decoupling from VCs with Chinese companies and things like that we read about.
Yes.
How do you see that playing out? Are things going to get better or plateau?
So to understand China's perspective, typically speaking, historically as well, has been to think of China from the lens of stability and harmony. Right? So China's biggest goal has always been to ensure that it has a harmonious state in its nation. In other words, to make sure that there's no revolutions, that people don't do crazy stuff, right? And that means you have to have certain kind of controls. So monetary policy, fiscal policy would be things that would be under the control of China to ensure that you have basically sort of a stable place, right? And so the thing that I would say is a problem for China is sort of the which we can see with the free flow of sort of markets is the free market transactions that we see in the rest of the world is not really possible in China, right? The free flow of currencies isn't really possible in China. And the same thing, we shouldn't expect the free flow of cryptocurrencies to have the same thing as well. But that doesn't mean, though, that you can't actually own crypto. It just means that you have to do it in a manner, like, say, through Hong Kong, which is controlled, for instance, because you want to make sure that it doesn't sort of destabilize the country in one form or the other for whatever reason. For instance, speculation, events like FTX, stuff like that. China just doesn't want any of that, understandably so. So they want to control that. So you have to imagine that just like, China has done this with the internet, there's essentially a kind of closed permission blockchain that's going to exist in China that will then interface through Hong Kong, essentially into the permissionless world, which is basically what they've done with the internet. And I think really of the various nations in the world, I think China is probably the only country in the world that can probably pull something like this off. But broadly speaking, it's a unique China perspective. But as we would say, and we would believe, that even if it's a permission chain, there's still more transparency because it's on chain. You can see things that are happening, right? And you'll be able to see transactions. And while there'll be ways in which that can be controlled, what can be displayed and seen by others will remain in sort of this transparent manner, which to me broadly is progress, because more transparency is generally better overall. I also think that for a place like China, it's trying to sort of strike the balance between creating and building global innovation, which they want to have, and they can't do that by stifling it down to sort of a version that is just simply too dumb, because you won't be able to compete with the world. And I think for a country like China that's basically been sort of pushing exports and innovation and technology, I think they do understand that. And again, without sort of going to specifics around sort of various companies as to why they've been sort of clamping down, I think again it has to do with the control and power dynamic that exists there.
Got it. And so right now, around the world, where are the hot spots? I mean, are things migrating in different ways? And how do you predict?
I mean, for sure, Hong Kong is a hotspot. I mean, UAE, like Dubai, is a hotspot. But Southeast Asia is also a hotspot. I mean, here's the other thing. When you think about crypto adoption, I think in the US, it still remains in the single-digit percentages. But in places like Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, it's 70 to 18%, for instance, right? So again, I do expect that sort of Web3 and crypto adoption is just generally going to happen in Asia and perhaps South America and maybe even the Middle East in comparison to the US. One has to also understand that in the US, a lot of people sometimes don't see the point, because they say, well, I have money, cash works for me, so why do I need this sort of digital version of money, right? Why does self-sovereignty of our assets matter, for instance? Because they're very comfortable with what they own. Whereas in places like Asia, most people did not have actually sovereignty of anything. I mean, South Korea's economy 40, 50 years ago was smaller than North Korea. China, I mean, say what we will about China, politically, but economically, it's basically a capitalist country. And, emerging from its sort of embracing capitalism has essentially helped lift, close to 1 billion people out of poverty in China, for instance. And Southeast Asia is the same. So meaning that in living memory, most people in Asia understand the benefits of capitalism and its value, despite the fact there's inequity. Whereas I would say in the US, it's a bit of the opposite. If you're a young American 30 years ago, you might feel worse off than you were before. And that's supposed to be in the framework of capitalism. So that doesn't seem to work so well, right? And so they become more socialist leaning. You can see in some of the recent Pew study research where actually the narrative around socialism has gained momentum. In fact, I would argue that that's become somewhat of a political platform for one of the parties. And this idea that you could even utter the word socialist in America 10, 20 years ago would have been absolute suicide. And today, it's a platform. And so I think it says something about the state of the world from those perspectives.
Got it. And what about the impact of AI, GPT, generative AI? How is that affecting not only your world, but the world?
Well, so first of all, I think, while I think some of the excitement around AI is now leveling off, as to be expected, generally speaking, AI is transformative for sure. But I think a lot of questions arise around this, which I think Web3 and crypto and blockchain have an answer for. So the first one is about our digital rights. Well, if we end up basically using our assets and our content to create all this AI, then we need to have a stake in this, after all, because there wouldn't be any self-driving cars if we weren't driving Teslas, and nor would there be basically ChatGPT if we weren't basically chatting and talking to people online and creating content for ChatGPT to learn from, for instance, right? So OpenAI basically uses the framework of the information of the world that we generated as end users, but doesn't really give us that value back other than the fact that we become users of it in a sense. So, that means that our digital rights can be managed on chain, which means that if, an AI generates value from your data, it can start paying you a value back to you, which I think is how the future will work. Right? And I think on-chain is one way in which you can protect, sort of IP and rights. The second one is around sort of, autonomous agents, particularly the autonomous agents that you see in gaming, like NPCs, for instance. We already transact with them every day, but in a state of a Web3 perspective, you're going to be transacting with them with real value. And that real value will be transacted to buy things or trade things, for instance. Are they going to do this in fiat? No, they're going to use this in crypto. So in other words, sort of, AI itself, native currency is going to be digital currency. It's going to be crypto. And so that will accelerate. So we should expect, as the autonomous AI start doing business with each other or with other people, shall we say, they're going to be doing that essentially in crypto. So I think that's going to accelerate in a big fat way as well. So we think Web3 and crypto and blockchain are very much and AI are very much intertwined.
Right. And what about outside of NFTs and blockchain? How do you see it, changing the landscape of society?
So, I mean, first of all, one of the things that we're very excited about is that we think that Web3 can change this perspective of so we're big believers still in capitalism. We think capitalism is the right sort of broad force of good because it provides incentives, and we need incentives to basically keep innovating and growing and building. But the current form of shareholder capitalism has kind of sort of put things a little bit sort of pear-shaped, because really only a small number of people, which are the shareholders and the founders of these businesses, get the benefit. But the very people who have helped build those businesses, like the users on Instagram, for instance, or the users on the platforms, or the creators on Spotify, they're the ones who actually make the platform. If it wasn't for them, essentially, the shareholders and the founders wouldn't have value in their business. And so how do you give that back? And this is where we think this stakeholder capitalism starts to become sort of valuable and interesting, because in the narrative of Web3, we get to own our data paradigm, and every person ends up basically becoming effectively a stakeholder / quasi-shareholder in the networks that they help construct. And that's where we think value can actually be shared more fairly across. So we don't believe, for instance, the future is going to be sort of universal basic income, where everyone gets sort of, base living money so they can survive and grow from there. We think that it makes more sense for people to have essentially kind of universal basic equity, where everyone essentially owns something and has rights to something, their intellectual property or their property at large, for which they can then develop on top of. And the more they enhance their property, the more value will be generated from that, because data is a property. So that's what we think the future will be, that data becomes a human right, it becomes data ownership, sort of digital self-sovereignty essentially becomes as important and as critical as our physical self-sovereignty, right? All these aspects basically will become mainstay. And if you consider that we already spend most of our waking hours effectively online in one form or the other, whether it's glued to the phone, whether we're talking here on Zoom, whether we're playing video games, then it kind of starts to make sense that we need to have a way in which we can have the same rights and frameworks as we have in the physical world, in the digital one. Because in the past, and because it happened so fast, digital was an extension of physical. But I would argue today that actually perhaps our physical has become an extension to our digital. So take the gaming industry, for instance. Gaming industry is a digital first construct. And that actually now has started to influence the physical world, not just with gaming culture. For instance, we wouldn't have, GPUs from NVIDIA if it wasn't for the gaming industry. We wouldn't have curved screens. We wouldn't have keyboards that go clickety-clack and shine neon colors if it wasn't for the gaming industry. So the use case didn't come from physical first. Let me make this mouse and this curved screen and these incredible graphic cards. It came because a digital construct needed a physical experience. So we're already seeing how the digital first experiences are influencing the physical world. And now with social influencers, with TikTok, with Instagram, that's just becoming even bigger. So we need to have a way in which we can protect our digital rights. And I think Web3 and blockchain allow us to do that.
And which country or society or region might be the first to sort of get considerable traction in that? Is there one country or region that stands out?
No, I mean, I would say, I think Southeast Asia has a good chance for that because many of the things that they need, crypto solves more immediately. But of course, from a policy standpoint, I would say, Hong Kong and Japan are definitely pushing that forward. The irony is that the whole sort of sense of digital property rights, freedom, and liberalism is a very American value, right? And in fact, it's not a surprise that, America really did lead sort of the whole sort of, I guess Web3 and crypto space in the earlier days. If it wasn't for, I guess some of the policy directions or these intentions that are sort of putting a little bit of a chill in the US market, I think the US would be naturally leading in that space.
Got it. And what about looking to the future for young people? Is there some guidance that you give them in general as far as they look out toward online, digital, Web3 possibilities?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that, when you think about sort of the online world, particularly sort of Web3 and digital, it is the world, it's the future, but it's also the native platform of our youth, right? That's what they're most comfortable with. And so they should embrace this and they should basically completely adopt it if they can, because that's what they are more comfortable with than basically, people like us, frankly speaking, right? Because that's their life, right? They get it, right? I look at my daughter, the way she handles social, and I'm amazed at what you can do there. Or I look at, for instance, my sons, and they play video games, and they'll crush me any day, right? Because they're just so much more skilled and better at it. So definitely, I would say look at that space, but also, as I say, back from the entrepreneurial perspective, or just generally, do things with purpose, right? If you, and again, it's easier said than done, but if you have a purpose and a vision of what it is that you want to do that's greater than your own, then you're willing to sort of approach it. And I think we see this a little bit today. Like we see this with young people that they're not happy to just work for a company for salary, which is perhaps more of our own generation, right? Because we needed money to just survive. They want to work for a company that means something, that's trying to change the world, or that's gives them a sense of meaning. And so I think again that's really important.
Got it. This has been a fascinating conversation. Yeah, really appreciate it. We usually like to share just one thing with our audience. So, what would be, let's say, your vision of an ideal future with regard to Web3 and beyond?
So one of the big injustices that we see in the world right now is the fact that most people don't actually have good financial literacy at all. It's one of the things that Web 1 couldn't solve. It democratized information and knowledge, but it wasn't able to democratize financial knowledge. And that's why we have a gap between Wall Street and the rest of the world. That's why we have a wealth gap, because people don't know what the difference is between labor and capital. And we've seen what happened in the decades before, what happened between capital and labor. If you were in the world of capital, you outperformed. If you were in the world of labor, you underperform. And this is going to just get worse with AI, right? And machines. So the ideal future that we see Web3 deliver, because Web3 is a financial construct as well, is that though most of the world will become financially literate. We've seen this in places like the Philippines with Axie Infinity, where players of Axie Infinity who don't have a bank account or financially excluded, never went to college, basically started to join the world in crypto and became banked effectively in a crypto sense. And then they had economic opportunity and they could start building portfolios. And I see this happening with our children, because if we can teach our children algebra and math and sort of derivatives, we can certainly teach them about economics and compound interest. And so I see this in an ideal future, where we learn through play and through blockchain games, for instance. Our children will learn about economics, about financial systems, become financially literate, so that by the time they go to college, if they need to even go to college or they want to, they'll have a portfolio. They'll understand basically, interest rates. They'll understand investment. They won't become predators to high interest rate credit cards or different type of sort of loans and debts that essentially make them sort of in the form of indentured servitude, because they have to start repaying that debt, for instance. Like that's kind of what we hope the world will look like in the future. where we'll have our financial freedoms because we've become more financially literate at a very young age.
Great. And usually, we usually end with a poem or a saying or a quote. What would you like to share with our audience?
Well, we speak about digital property rights, so I think it's quite appropriate that we bring up George Washington's quote. Basically, what he said was, freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And the same is absolutely true for digital property rights.
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much. Yeah, this has been great. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like it, leave a review, and subscribe. See you soon.